Mumbai is probably a lot closer to disappearing than you think. Most people who've heard about sea level rise imagine it as a distant, abstract threat, something that'll affect low-lying Pacific islands or remote coastal villages in Bangladesh. Not a megacity of 21 million people, not the financial capital of the world's most populous nation, not one of the most economically critical cities on the entire planet. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Mumbai isn't just at a risk of flooding by 2100. It's already flooding. Right now. Every single monsoon season. And the forces that are driving that flooding are only accelerating. The real question isn't whether Mumbai will flood. It's whether Mumbai will still be a functioning, livable city by the time your children are your age. And to understand why, you first need to understand something about what Mumbai actually is. Because most people don't realize that modern Mumbai shouldn't really exist at all in the form that it does today. What is today the city of Mumbai was originally not one landmass at all. It was an archipelago, a collection of 7 separate islands sitting off the western coast of India in the Arabian Sea. The islands were inhabited for thousands of years by fishing communities who called the area home long before any colonial power arrived. But it was the Portuguese who first recognized the strategic value of the natural deep-water harbor that sat between these islands in the 16th century. And then, in 1661, the Portuguese handed the islands over to the British Crown as part of a royal wedding dowry. The British East India Company subsequently leased the islands from the Crown and immediately began one of the most ambitious land reclamation projects in history. Over the course of roughly 2 centuries, the British systematically filled in the shallow waters between the 7 islands using rock, soil, and debris, gradually stitching them together into a single continuous landmass. The last major causeway connecting the islands was completed in 1845, and by the time India won its independence in 1947, what had once been a scattered archipelago had been transformed into a single connected peninsula, jutting out into the Arabian Sea that we recognize on maps today as Mumbai. The reason this matters so much is that the ground that tens of millions of people live on in Mumbai today is not solid bedrock. Large parts of it are reclaimed land, former shallow seabed that was filled in and built over. And reclaimed land behaves very differently from natural land when it comes to flooding, sea level rise, and storm surges. It compacts, it sinks, and it is dramatically more vulnerable to being inundated by the very sea that it was literally taken from. And that vulnerability is only being made worse by what is happening to that sea right now. The Arabian Sea, like every other ocean on Earth, is warming, and warming oceans expand. This is a process called thermal expansion, and it is one of the 2 primary drivers of global sea level rise, alongside the melting of glaciers and ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica. Together, these 2 forces have already raised the global average sea level by roughly 20 centimeters compared to where it was in 1900. And the pace of that rise is not staying constant. It is accelerating. Between 1901 and 1971, the global average sea level rose by about 1.3 millimeters per year. Between 2006 and 2018, that rate had more than doubled to around 3.7 millimeters per year. And the most recent data suggests it is now rising at closer to 4.5 millimeters per year and climbing. Now, those numbers might sound small in isolation, but stop and actually think about what they mean in practice for a city like Mumbai.
By the year 2050,
because Mumbai doesn't just face the gradual creep of rising seas, it faces something far more immediately dangerous. It faces the Arabian Sea during monsoon season. Every year between June and September, Mumbai receives somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 millimeters of rainfall. To put that in perspective, London receives around 600 millimeters of rainfall across an entire year. Mumbai receives more than 3 times that amount in roughly 100 days. And when that rainfall hits a low-lying coastal city built substantially on reclaimed land with drainage infrastructure that was largely designed by the British in the 19th century and has never been fundamentally overhauled since, the results are predictably catastrophic. The flooding that struck Mumbai in July of 2005 remains the single most vivid illustration of what the city is genuinely up against. In a single 24-hour period, the northern suburbs of Mumbai received 944 millimeters of rainfall. Nearly a full year's worth of rainfall in London in one day. The city's drainage system collapsed almost immediately. Streets became rivers. Sub and rail lines disappeared under meters of water. Hundreds of thousands of people were stranded. Official death tolls eventually reached over 1,000.